Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Mara Klein. Tonight, an episode we kept circling back to because, frankly, it won't let go. The disappearance of 28-year-old Lars Mittank, a young man on his first holiday outside Germany, last seen sprinting from Varna Airport in Bulgaria on July 8, 2014, running toward a forest and then vanishing. Over the next hour, we'll reconstruct his final days, listen to the footage that made him a viral symbol of mystery, and, with the help of Dr. Leon Hartman, try to separate clinical possibility from speculation. This is seriously eerie, and, as always, we're mindful of the family at the center of this. Let's begin. Leon, thank you for being with me. Before we dive into the footage and the theories, can you tell listeners briefly who you are and why you wanted to talk about this case?
Of course, Mara. I'm Leon Hartman, a psychiatrist and forensic psychology consultant based in Berlin. My work focuses on first-episode psychosis and the psychiatric effects of medications and substances. I've followed the Mittank case partly because it sits at the intersection of travel, sudden behavioral collapse, and the Internet's appetite for viral mystery. I wanted to bring an evidence-based voice to a story that's often sensationalized. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Leon. So let's set the scene. Lars Mittank was born in 1986 from Itzehoe in northern Germany, a steady job at a power plant, close to his parents, an ordinary 28-year-old who loved football and friends. By all accounts, he wasn't someone with a psychiatric history. He travels with 5 friends to Golden Sands on the Black Sea, what people describe as a normal guy's holiday. For most of the trip, friends say, he's relaxed, joking, playing football, nothing remarkable. That makes what happens at the end feel out of place.
Right, Mara. And that contrast is one of the reasons the case is so unsettling. Many severe psychiatric conditions first appear in people who seemed fine before. The late 20s is still within the typical window for onset of disorders like schizophrenia. Combine that vulnerability with sleep disruption, alcohol, possible drugs, minor head trauma, it can precipitate a rapid change. But it's critical to look at the timeline in detail before leaping to conclusions.
Let's walk that timeline. June 30, 2014, arrival in Varna. The week goes like a normal resort holiday. Then, July 6, an argument in a bar about football. Yes, as trivial as a club rivalry. And later that night, Lars disappears from his group. He returns the next morning, injured, jaw trauma, and a ruptured eardrum, he tells his friends. But this is where accounts start to diverge. They say he was attacked by 4 men hired by fans he argued with. No names, no eyewitnesses beyond his own story. He sees a local doctor, is advised not to fly due to the eardrum. He's prescribed an antibiotic, Cefprozil. He decides to stay an extra night and to let his friends fly home without him. Leon, that decision, insisting the others leave, any clinical color on what that might mean?
It's complicated. On one hand, insisting friends go home can be perfectly reasonable. He might have believed he could handle a night or get another flight later. On the other hand, in the context of a potential stressor like a physical assault and emerging paranoia, it's a decision that increases vulnerability. Being alone in an unfamiliar place magnifies risks. Clinically, a person in the early stages of a psychotic process might still appear organized in certain domains, like telling friends not to worry, while internal experience unravels. So the outward appearance of competence can be deceptive.
By the way, when we say ruptured eardrum, that becomes important because a local doctor tells him not to fly. Boarding a commercial aircraft with a perforated eardrum can be painful and risky. So the reason given for staying behind is medically plausible. But then Lars moves from the resort to a cheaper airport hotel, the Hotel Color, and this is where things start to tighten. Surveillance footage from the hotel shows him pacing hallways, looking out windows, hiding in an elevator. He calls his mother in the evening and speaks in a whisper, says people are trying to kill or rob him, instructs her to cancel his cards. He calls again early July 8th, sounding more frantic, saying people are getting closer. Lars, whispering to his mother, telling her to cancel cards, that's a classic paranoid theme, right?
Yes, Mara. Fears about money or identity theft are common in persecutory delusions. The content, they want my money, they're after my passport, is consistent with paranoid ideation. The behavior, hiding, pacing, scanning, is also consistent. But we have to be cautious. There are two broad possibilities. 1, he's being genuinely pursued or threatened. 2, he's experiencing an internally generated fear that has no external basis. Determining which is true requires corroboration beyond his subjective claims. We don't have strong independent evidence of real pursuers.
There's also this odd gap. CCTV shows he leaves the hotel at about 1 a.m. and returns about an hour later. No one knows where he went that hour. That hour is a hard-to-fill hole in the narrative. Okay, next morning, taxi to Varna Airport. Witnesses described him as frantic, with dilated pupils. He gets to the terminal, and he goes to see the airport doctor, Dr. Kosta Kostov. Leon, can you run through what the doctor reported?
Dr. Kostov's account is often quoted. He says that when Lars arrived at the airport, he seemed nervous and somewhat erratic, but physically stable. Kostov examined him and judged him fit to fly, despite the eardrum issue. Crucially, Kostov reports that Lars had not filled the antibiotic prescription and had not taken Cefprozil. According to Kostov, Lars was told he could fly home. Then, while they were talking, a construction worker entered the examination room. The airport was under renovation. And Kostov says Lars suddenly began to tremble, shouted, "I don't want to die here. I have to get out of here," and bolted, leaving everything behind.
That line, "I don't want to die here," it chills you. The CCTV that follows is the footage that made the case famous. Lars running down the terminal, bursting through the glass doors, sprinting across the car park, climbing a chain-link fence, running into a field, and then toward a nearby forest. The frames are clear. For many, the image of a healthy young man abandoning passport, wallet, phone, luggage is the deepest mystery. Leon, people ask, why would someone flee and leave everything? What does that suggest?
Leaving behind identity documents and cash is highly unusual if someone is planning a rational escape. If you're being chased by criminals who want your identity or money, you'd normally keep them. In psychotic states, though, the subjective experience of threat can be so overwhelming that immediate escape, regardless of practicality, becomes the dominant motivation. People in acute panic often experience tunnel behavior, fixating on fleeing rather than on possessions. There's also a subset of conditions, certain types of delirium or substance-induced states, where decision-making is profoundly impaired.
That's an important point. Let's pause here. I want to be clear for listeners. Many online threads have fixated on the idea of organized crime or trafficking, but evidence of that is thin. No ransom calls, no activity on his accounts, no confirmed connections to criminal networks. The family, especially his mother Sandra, has maintained hope. She's been outspoken, hiring a private investigator, launching a Facebook page, and publicly saying she believes he might still be alive, maybe with amnesia or living homeless somewhere. Leon, how do families process this kind of ambiguous loss?
Ambiguous loss is one of the cruelest forms of grief. Not knowing whether a loved one is alive prevents closure. Families oscillate between hope and despair, and that's psychologically understandable. It also makes them open to all sorts of scenarios because they have to keep hope alive. From a clinical perspective, that hope can be adaptive. It motivates action, keeps the case visible, but it also makes families vulnerable to misinformation and exploitation in online forums. It's important to empathize with Sandra. She's in a situation everyone listening would dread.
Absolutely. Let's examine the main theories people talk about, and I'll let you weigh in on the psychiatric plausibility as we go. First, acute mental illness, a psychotic break. The facts that favor this: sudden paranoia, whispering on the phone, hiding, the extreme reaction to a construction worker, abandonment of possessions. The facts against: no documented prior history. Leon, explain to listeners how plausible it is for someone with no prior history to have a first psychotic episode at 28.
Very plausible, Mara. Schizophrenia spectrum disorders and some bipolar disorders commonly emerge in late adolescence to the early 30s, with a peak in the mid-20s for men, sometimes extending into the late 20s. The onset can be abrupt, especially under stress. Crucially, a first episode can look chaotic: paranoia, auditory hallucinations, persecutory delusions, and the person may retain coherent elements of behavior while simultaneously experiencing a terrifying internal reality. So the absence of documented history does not rule out a primary psychiatric event.
Next major theory: antibiotic-induced psychosis. Cefprozil is a cephalosporin. There are documented, albeit rare, neuropsychiatric side effects from some antibiotics: hallucinations, delirium. The twist in the Mittank story is that Dr. Kostov says Lars never filled the prescription, so he likely didn't take it. Leon, how common and how convincing is this antibiotic theory?
Antibiotic-induced psychosis is real but rare. Cephalosporins have been associated with neuropsychiatric reactions in case reports, particularly in older patients or those with renal impairment, but it is not a common cause in healthy young adults. The critical issue in this case is the claim by the airport doctor that Lars hadn't even filled the prescription. If that's accurate, the hypothesis weakens considerably. Without toxicology or pharmacy records showing he took the drug, it's speculative. However, because medication can uncommonly trigger significant changes, it's reasonable to consider it among plausible causes, but it shouldn't eclipse other more likely explanations without corroboration.
Understood. Okay, next, recreational drugs. Golden Sands is a party resort. Witnesses in the taxi reported dilated pupils, which can be a sign of stimulants. Stimulant-induced psychosis, amphetamine or synthetic cathinones, can cause paranoia and violent flight reactions lasting hours to days. Leon, how would you weigh the drug theory here?
It's plausible. Psychosis induced by psychoactive substances is common in resort environments. Substances like amphetamines, cocaine, certain designer drugs, and synthetic cannabinoids can cause severe, sometimes prolonged paranoia. Dilated pupils are consistent with stimulants. On the downside, there's no direct evidence. No blood or urine tests were collected in a state that would allow confirmation. Friends didn't publicly report heavy use, but they might not have been with him every minute. Given the environment, the drug hypothesis remains a credible option in the absence of toxicological data.
Short question. Could a single dose of some of these substances induce something that lasts days or even weeks?
Yes, particularly with synthetic cannabinoids and certain adulterants, a single exposure can precipitate a prolonged psychotic episode in vulnerable individuals. Stimulant-related psychosis often resolves as the drug clears, but in some cases it can persist, especially if sleep deprivation and stress continue. We can't be definitive here, but the temporal profile could fit.
Thanks, Leon. Another widely discussed option is foul play, that the attack on the beach was real and the men who assaulted him were genuinely threatening, possibly linked to organized crime or trafficking. Proponents point to his claim that 4 men were hired, and the idea that the construction worker at the airport might have been one of them. Counterpoint: there's no evidence of follow-up, no suspicious bank activity, and no police leads tying him to a criminal network. Leon, clinically, does the content of his fear make it more likely that it was real or imagined?
Content alone is not diagnostic. A real acute traumatic event, like an assault, can sensibly lead someone to fear reprisals. If he had identifiable attackers, his fear could have been entirely rational. But absent corroboration, no detailed suspect descriptions, no witnesses of the attack aside from Lars, we have to treat it cautiously. People in psychotic states often attribute malevolent intentions to strangers and groups. Conversely, real threats are more common than sensationalized theories suggest. From my perspective, it's an open question, plausible but unproven.
Let's talk about the possibility of accidental death. He runs into fields and toward woodland in summer heat. Could he have collapsed, been injured, died of exposure, and simply not been found? Search teams in Bulgaria looked for him. No trace was found. Leon, how likely is it that someone could die a short distance from an airport and remain undiscovered?
Tragically, it's more possible than people assume. Depending on the terrain, dense brush, ravines, abandoned pits, construction sites, a person could fall, be injured, and be obscured by vegetation. Scavenging animals can scatter remains, and if no clothing or ID is found, detection becomes harder. Summer heat can exacerbate the rate of decomposition and scattering. That said, airport perimeters are often traversed, but searches done immediately after disappearance are not infallible. So accidental death is a distressing but plausible outcome, painful precisely because it leaves few answers.
We should pause and read listeners an oft-quoted phrase from Dr. Kostov. He didn't take those antibiotics. He didn't even fill out his prescription. I can't think of a single reason why he left my office in such a panic. That statement has been used to argue against the antibiotic theory, and it carries weight because it comes from the doctor who saw him minutes before he ran. But, Leon, memory can be fallible. How much weight should we give to that single recollection?
Medical recollections are meaningful, but not fallible. Kostov was in the room with Lars and had a professional vantage, so his account is valuable. Yet people's recollection of whether someone filled a prescription, especially in a busy clinic, can be mistaken. Ideally, we would triangulate with pharmacy records or witness testimony. In absence of that, Kostov's account is a strong piece of evidence, but it doesn't close the case definitively.
Let's cover another angle: voluntary disappearance. Some propose Lars staged this to start fresh. He was young, single, and keen to travel. But he left his passport, phone, money, and luggage. Leon, how often do people successfully disappear like that without a plan?
Very rarely, if they act with no planning. Voluntary disappearances that result in sustained new lives usually involve some preparation, Cash, a new identity, planned contacts. The way Lars fled, leaving everything, suggests panic rather than careful planning. So voluntary disappearance as a carefully staged act seems unlikely. Spontaneous attempts to disappear without resources usually fail or result in extreme hardship. They don't often look like this.
Wow. Another element people point to is the internet's role. The airport CCTV went viral. By 2018, versions had millions of views. The case becomes folklore. YouTube videos, Reddit theories, late-night speculations. That amplified attention can help searches, but it also produces a lot of noise. Leon, what's the impact of viral cases on families and on the clinical appraisal of such events?
Viral attention is a double-edged sword. On the positive side, it keeps a case in public consciousness, which can generate leads. On the negative side, it attracts sensational and often misleading theories. Families can be re-traumatized seeing their loved ones' last moments looped worldwide. Clinically, the virality can also spread misinformation about plausible causes and delay more sober, methodical investigations. It complicates the grieving process and can introduce false leads that waste resources.
We touched on sightings. Over the years, there have been unconfirmed reports. A truck driver near Varna a year later, a 2019 German trucker who gave a ride to a man he later thought resembled Lars. None were verified. Leon, from a behavioral standpoint, if someone is alive and disoriented, what patterns of movement might we expect? Hitchhiking? Transient work? Drifting between countries?
People who are disoriented or losing their identity often become transient. They might hitchhike, take casual labor jobs, or end up in shelters or hospitals with amnesia. Some cases show movement along transportation corridors, truck routes, rail lines, and border crossings, because those are easy ways to move without planning. But most of these sightings are circumstantial. Without biometric confirmation, fingerprints, DNA, verified images, they remain speculative. Still, these are the sorts of patterns investigators look for.
Let's get more clinical for a moment. Describe for our listeners what a first psychotic break might sound like. What behaviors, beliefs, or sensory experiences might a person have that would explain the flight we see on CCTV?
A first psychotic break can present with persecutory delusions, firm beliefs that others intend to harm you, and with hallucinations, often auditory. The person may hear voices commanding them or commenting, which can be terrifying. They may misinterpret neutral stimuli as threatening. Behaviorally, you might see hypervigilance, pacing, hiding, whispering, and sudden flight. In severe panic, the person may run aimlessly, fixated on escaping perceived danger. Importantly, the person may seem otherwise coherent. They can answer basic questions, remember facts, and plan superficially, which is why friends often underestimate the severity of what's unfolding. Importantly, the person may seem otherwise coherent. They can answer basic questions, remember facts, and plan superficially, which is why friends often underestimate the severity of what's unfolding.
Thank you. That helps listeners understand the internal logic a person is operating from. I want to talk about one more theory that I find lurid but persistent: organ trafficking or kidnapping. Internet forums love it. Real-world investigators say such scenarios are statistically unlikely without corroborating evidence. Leon?
Organ trafficking narratives are dramatic and emotionally potent, which is why they spread online. In reality, organ trafficking is a terrible crime, but typically involves vulnerable populations with premeditation, not seemingly random tourists who sprint into woods. Forensic investigators need evidence. Traffickers don't usually act by acquiring one person's passport and walking out. That theory appeals because it's cinematic, but there's no credible evidence in Lars' case to support it. It's a theory I'd rank low in probability given the known facts.
We've been careful to avoid sensationalizing this story, but we also owe listeners a thorough accounting of the unanswered questions. Let me list some that still gnaw at investigators and at Sandra. Did he take any antibiotics? What happened in that missing hour at the hotel? Were his attackers real? Was the construction worker someone he recognized, or did the worker's arrival simply trigger a delusion? Why was no trace ever found? Leon, any final clinical observations about those unanswered questions?
2 related observations. First, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Searches can miss things, witnesses can be mistaken. Second, many plausible hypotheses remain because we lack key data. Pharmacy records, toxicology, more hotel CCTV, or thorough follow-ups on the early morning taxi and people he encountered. Clinically, I'd say the most plausible causes remain either a first psychotic episode, possibly triggered by stress or substance use, or substance-induced psychosis. Foul play and accidental death remain possibilities, but the specifics needed to elevate them to likelihood are missing.
Let's take a moment to humanize Lars. He was 28, dark blonde hair, about 5'11", described by friends as good-humored and attentive, someone who helped his family when his father had a stroke. This isn't a story about a horror film villain. It's about a young man, a son, a friend, who vanished in an instant of terror. Sandra, his mother, continues to hope and look. Private investigators have checked hospitals and fielded tips. German police keep the missing person listing active. Leon, what does a family living with this kind of unresolved disappearance need from the public and from professionals?
Compassion and accuracy. Families need credible leads, not speculation. They need investigators to follow tips thoroughly, and for the media to avoid amplifying unfounded theories that re-traumatize them. From a healthcare standpoint, families need access to mental health expertise that can help them understand possible scenarios without blame. And, importantly, they need the community to keep the case visible in constructive ways, sharing verified information with authorities rather than viral conspiracies.
If any listeners have a credible tip, the appropriate channel is to contact local authorities or the German Police Missing Persons Unit. There are also private investigators working the case and family pages that collect official leads. We'll include official sourcing and reference material in the episode notes for anyone who wants to follow up. Before we close, Leon, I want to ask, what are the ethical responsibilities we have when retelling cases like this? Viral videos of someone's last known moments when the family is watching.
Respect, Mara. We have to remember these are human tragedies, not entertainment. That means careful language, avoiding sensational frames, and prioritizing the family's experience. It also means not elevating fringe theories simply because they make for more compelling stories. We must insist on proportionality. Give weight to what evidence supports and be transparent about uncertainty. Finally, we should consider the psychological harm of replaying someone's last frightened moments for clicks. That harm should weigh into editorial decisions.
I agree. Leon, thank you. This has been a sobering but important conversation. Before we sign off, I want us to do something we do at the end of every episode. Reflect for a moment on the person at the center, Lars Mittank, described as a kind son, a friend, a worker. He disappeared on July 8, 2014, age 28. The footage of him running into a field is one of the most watched missing persons videos of the internet era, yet it offers no answers. Leon, one last humane question. If Lars had a first psychotic episode and survived, what might his life trajectory have been following something like that?
I agree. Leon, thank you. This has been a sobering but important conversation.
If Lars had a psychotic episode and survived, his outcome would depend on whether he received timely psychiatric care. With early intervention, antipsychotic medication, therapy, social support, many people stabilize and regain function. Without care, some deteriorate, become homeless, or cycle through hospitals and shelters. The tragedy in cases like this is the narrow window where intervention can alter the course. That's why the unknown in Lars's case feels so heavy. We don't know whether an effective intervention could have saved him and restored a life.
That point, that narrow possibility, is what makes this story haunt us. Thank you, Leon, for helping untangle clinical plausibility from speculation, and for treating this with the seriousness it deserves. To our listeners, if you have credible, verifiable information, please contact the appropriate authorities, German police, missing persons, or Bulgarian authorities if it's directly relevant. We'll include links and official channels in the episode notes.
Thank you, Mara. And to anyone listening who recognizes the experience of sudden fear, paranoia, or an unfolding mental health crisis, reach out for help. Early contact with professionals can change outcomes. And to Sandra and Lars's family, you're in many people's thoughts.
Next week on Still Unanswered, we'll be looking at another disappearance. This one closer to home, and very different, but with some similar questions around memory and identity. For now, we leave Lars's last image as it was, sprinting into a field, then out of sight. Still unanswered. I'm Mara Klein. Thanks for listening. Credits. This episode was researched using public records, interviews, and media reporting on the Mittank case, including the airport footage and statements from Dr. Kostov. For full sourcing and links, see the episode notes. If you or someone you love is in crisis, please contact your local emergency services or a mental health hotline. Good night.